Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm a trustee for SANHS. Today we're going to hear a talk about the challenges of conservation of ruined buildings by Bruce Induni. Bruce Induni began his working life as an archaeologist, but in 1982 he lifted his eyes above the ground level to discover the archaeology of standing buildings. In the early 1980s, he started work on the west front of Wells Cathedral, learning how to repair stonework with lime mortars. Soon after this, he began his own conservation practice, repairing church monuments in such exotic places as Tewkesbury Abbey. In 1995, he started work as a senior lecturer at Bournemouth University, specialising in the repair of traditional buildings. Since then, he's also taught at Plymouth University, Cardiff University, and the Building Crafts College in London. During the lockdown, he used his time wisely by writing a book about the conservation of traditional buildings, which is called Travels in Conservation. In today's lecture, to make things simple, Bruce is taking questions at the end of the talk. To ask questions, you will need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. To find the button, just run the mouse over the bottom of your screen and a series of buttons should pop up. If the button's not there, it might be at the top of the top right of your screen or even hidden under 3 dots. Because we're recording this lecture, we won't be using names in the question time. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be gratefully appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation Ruins Webinar. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Bruce.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. The fluency of that description of who I am surprised me for a moment, but then I realised we've been married for more than 40 years and probably Lizzie does know who I am, so I think it's fairly accurate. Enough of that rubbish. I'll go straight into the lecture. I'm going to talk about a life in ruins. It's not my life in ruins. I've been absolutely fascinated by ruins and it hasn't ruined me at all. What I'm going to concentrate on is several themes within ruins. If I can get the screen to change. There we go. Well, all of that's true, and that's just in addition to what Lizzie described. But really what I'm going to talk about tonight is not me. It's about some puzzles and some answers. I'm going to look at what is a ruin very briefly, and I'll do that right now. There are actually lots of definitions of what a ruin could be, but the one I'm going to use is the simplest. It's a building without a roof. Really, you could get terribly complicated with this. You could start considering whether structures are the same as ruins, but we won't. We'll keep it simple, because there are plenty of other puzzles to look at. How are ruins created? What forces combine to cause a building to become a ruin? We'll look at that. We'll look at the way they are presented, which includes a huge variety of different presentation techniques, some of which are not at all logical. We'll look at how they're stabilized. Ruins are not forever. You have to work quite hard to keep ruins as they are. And we'll look at maintenance, which of course goes with stabilization and is a particularly gruesome issue in our austere times. Then we're going to look at beneficial use. And I hope that will generate quite a lot of questions. It's not something that was ever at the top of the agenda of ruined buildings, but for various reasons, which I'll look at, it's becoming increasingly important. And then I'll give a quick nod directly to the way that austerity, that is the starving of the public purse, has impacted on the organisation and the potential future for ruins. A lot of the ruins that we're going to look at tonight are in Somerset. We're in Somerset, and this is SANHS. Remembering that SANHS stands for the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which has got to be one of the worst acronyms I've ever come across. However, we'll look at mostly Somerset monuments, but that's quite tricky because Somerset is a changed beast. It used to glory to the north, but it doesn't anymore. For me, Bath is in Somerset, but apparently I'm told it isn't anymore. You notice the way hybrid way I said Bath, because I'm married to someone who comes from the north of England, and she says Bath. Well, I think baths are where you keep the coal, but on the other hand, my long, lazy southern drawl of Bath, that doesn't appeal to some people either. So we'll compromise now, Bath. Anyway, those are the strands that I'm going to look at. I will highlight some of them. Some of them will be obvious when we look at examples, but keep in mind that really pretty much all of them apply to all the pictures I'm going to show you. Let's start with a picture. You'll notice, of course, that this is not quite sepia tinted, but it's softly focused and it has a lovely fuzzy edge around it, because what we're talking about here is the romance of ruins. Why do we like ruins? Why do we keep them going? Why do we have them? Well, the answer is really very complicated, but one part of the answer is that 18th century gentlemen were classically educated, very probably went on a grand tour and saw the ruins at Pompeii, very obviously, very likely ruined themselves in various hostelries on the way, but they came back with the idea of the classical Arcadian landscape. Arcadia is an invention of the Roman poet Ovid, and it's a view of a magical world. What the estate owners, like this one at Stoodley Royal, often called Fountains Abbey, was trying to do was recreate a physical embodiment of Ovid's Arcadia. And there's an example. Lots of water, lots of ruins, a really quite false image of what, well, it's a history that never existed, but it's a romantic image. And the same is true at Stourhead. You know, it has mythical temples, it has vistas, it has lakes, it has exotic planting, and it is beautiful. Stourhead is a particularly good example of an Arcadian landscape because it's down in a valley which separates it from the reality of the world outside. It is a private, secret world. Now, the temple in the background isn't a ruin, it's a relatively modern construction, but they were interchangeable, these modern constructions, with genuine ruins. And in fact, even some fake ruins were built, especially to enhance the Arcadian landscape. And a particular feature of the ruins in Arcadian landscapes was the grotto. Every Arcadian landscape had to have an entrance to Hades. It had to have a reminder that life was not permanent. Et in Arcadia ego, in death I am present. And here's the inside. We're in Hades now, in this grotto at Stourhead, and you've got Venus on the left and Neptune on the right. Here, though, all the soft focus and fuzzy edges start to disappear. This image, this recreation, this popularization of ruins comes at a cost. You rebuild Arcadia, you've got to maintain it. It doesn't last. And here's why. In the world of pioneers of modern conservation, it was pretty rapidly realized, I'll put this in inverted commas for you as I speak it, romance is not conservation. The romance of Arcadia, which popularized ruins, and made them attractive and valuable didn't actually upkeep them. The romance of having them didn't necessarily get attached to the spending of money to maintain them. And you have to maintain them because we have particularly cruel weather in this country. I mean, actually, it's delightful. I wouldn't live anywhere else because the weather here is so good. It's never too hot and it's never too cold. But that's the problem when it comes to ruin. In the winter, the temperature hovers around plus and minus a few degrees. And it is that switch into and out of frost which is absolutely lethal to exposed stonework that hasn't got a roof. Vandalism, too, is another serious issue in the decay of ruins. Our great abbeys and castles were, to a considerable extent, deliberately vandalized, not by just Henry VIII and his commissioners or by Oliver Cromwell. They certainly did do some vandalism, but by people stealing the stone to build their own houses. Big ruins have always been a good quarry for building materials. Into this background of romance without funding to maintain ruins and ongoing vandalism enter some pretty amazing people. Mr. Lubbock sponsored the Ancient Monuments Act, which is the basis of all the legal protection that we have in this country for ancient monuments. He also outright bought Avebury in order to save it from being quarried. Curzon was an altogether different man. He wasn't an academic like Lubbock. He was the Viceroy of India. He was a grandee. Well, he was very keen on old buildings, and he used that keenness and his wealth, which was very considerable, to implement Lubbock's Ancient Monuments Act in such a way that it became illegal to destroy or damage scheduled ancient monuments. And in many ways, that protection has worked. He particularly came to fame for saving Tattershall Castle, which is in Humberside now, was in North Lincolnshire, and was one of the first uses of brick in this country. The early listing the early scheduling of ancient monuments was all in the hands of Major General Pitt Rivers, who was an amazing person again, worked incredibly hard, got an awful lot of things scheduled, mostly archaeological things, but when he died, he wasn't replaced. So there was no inspector of ancient monuments until effectively the 20th century. Enter an amazing civil servant, Mr. Pierce, who managed to charm and bully money out of the treasury to buy and maintain ancient monuments. I don't know how he did it. And with him was a man called Frank Baines, who was the chief architect of the Inspectorate of Ancient Monuments. Now he leads on into the rest of, more or less all the rest of all of my images, because he was the one that created the style which has become universal for conserving monuments. The Ministry of Works, guided by Frank Baines, set the agenda for what you did with ancient monuments. More of that as we go. Because the conservation of ancient monuments, and ruins in particular, is an ongoing experiment. Pitt Rivers, Baines, and the Ministry of Works didn't know how to do it for certain. They were experimenting. Now they're out of the way, largely. The experiment is still going on. How did the first traces of the experiment start? Well, they were before the Ministry of Works and Baines. One of the earliest examples is this jelly mould. The Society of Antiquaries, hereinafter known as the Sock of Ants, which isn't really any shorter to say than the Society of Antiquaries, but I rather like a sock full of ants as an image, so I'll say it that way. they realised that the ruins at Old Sarum needed protection, physical protection from the weather. They needed the water from rain and frost keeping out of the core of the walls. And what all these great shapeless piles of flint are about is trying to waterproof the top of the ruin. As is this rather quaint, perverse, almost attractive in its perverseness, is what they did to some of the curtain wall of Old Sarum Castle. The material, if you watch my cursor closely, up to that line is genuine medieval masonry. And above this line is a triangular pyramid all along here of sock of ants work. They were looking for a compromise, something that would keep the water out, but not look entirely as if it was fake original. This was a very strong movement in conservation at the time of the turn of the 20th century, because SPAB were arguing very effectively against fake material. What it is a Portland cement concrete based cap on the top of the wall. Switch to another site that was really pre-Ministry of Works conservation style, our very own Glastonbury. I won't say anything about thorns and King Arthur. What I will say is that the trustees of Glastonbury Abbey realised that they needed to do physical support to some of the ruins. They realised the ruins were accidentally as they'd been left, and as they had been accidentally left, they weren't permanent. They had to be propped up. And this mass of stones is designed to not fool anyone that it's original work. It's designed to be obviously honest as a repair. Now that's a very interesting turn of philosophy. What happens in, say, 100 years after that obvious honest repair has been done? Does it itself become historic material? And if it needs to be repaired, does that repair have to be honest so that it doesn't look like the honesty of the original repair? What a lovely philosophical tangle. Back to the Ministry of Works then. These early experiments were not widespread, though they are surprisingly common. You look at somewhere like Corfe Castle in Dorset, and there is a lot of Victorian work to it, mostly because some of the more extensive ruins were big tourist attractions, and the Victorians wanted them to stay physically strong enough to be tourist attractions. But the Ministry of Works, it had an organised approach. Frank Baines designed for the future. And his aims were, because all good work designed for the future has to have aims, were education and the excavation that went with that to make it more obvious, sterilisation and consolidation, and presentational things. Evidence of their Baines and the early MOW's work at education, little lead plaques like this, together with extraordinarily learned and barely readable blue guidebooks, which you can't get anymore. If you see them in the second-hand shops, do buy them, because they're wonderful explanations of the archaeology and history of the building. Then there was sterilisation. Here we've got Tintern Abbey, and on the left, as the Ministry of Works inherited it, it's a wonderful crop of ivy. Now, the Ministry of Works took a very simple view of ivy and plants like valerian and stonecrop. They were evil and had to be eradicated. They were destroying the monument. It's actually rather more complicated than that. Ivy can both destroy stonework and bind it together. And in a moment, we'll be talking about soft capping of ruined walls, which is the Ministry of Works' and its successor bodies' recognition that sterilisation was A, a waste of time, because the ivy grows back, as it's doing in the right-hand picture, and was also pretty damaging. You wreck stonework taking ivy out of it, and you also nullify the binding effect that it can have. The great weak spot of Baines's work, of the excavation and presentation, and this is much on the Abbey, which has been extensively excavated. Don't think archaeology, think rubble shifting. The reason that the base of these walls is visible is because the rubble that was strewn all over them has been deliberately removed. Exposing once buried masonry brings all sorts of maintenance issues. Once you've buried something, it becomes contaminated with soil, groundwater, and soluble mineral salts. If you've ever got another 2.5 hours to spare one day, well, I'll try and organise a webinar on what mineral salts do. For the moment, just take it from me, they wreck stonework. So once stonework has been buried, it's inherently more fragile than it was before it was buried. Now, the ministry didn't really cotton on to this. They thought that if you substituted lime mortar and got rid of it and put ordinary Portland cement in its place, the binding power of Portland cement would glue the whole thing together no matter what. Well, it doesn't. It's taken a good while to realize that, perhaps 80 years or so, but Portland cement is the answer to no maiden's prayers. Also in this picture, it's pretty obvious that weeds are starting to grow. When we look at towards the end, the reforms and changes to English heritage, historic England, and austerity, the lack of maintenance is an image to keep in your mind. At the moment, the grass is being cut, but very little else. So what did the ministry do? Not with ruins, walls that they had exposed, but with upstanding ruins. They realized that the killer for all upstanding ruined walls was water getting into the core of the wall, the insides of the wall. And how they got round this was rebuilding the top of the wall. At Oakhampton Castle, this is relatively recent, 1970s. Oh, I always forget how old I am. The 1970s for many is not very recent at all. Eek, it was 50 years ago. Well, in this modern phase of Ministry of Works work 50 years ago, I think you can see fairly easily that there is a change in the masonry at this level. Below that level, there are more of these big stones, and the whole thing is grayer with less of these thin slaty stones. Above this level, more slaty stones, less big ones, and an altogether different colour. The lichens growing on the original are different from the moulds growing on the new, and it is new. Everything from here upwards is Ministry of Works' new work, masquerading as the old wall and functioning as a waterproof cap to keep rain out of the wall. It's actually not functioning very well. The problem here is ordinary Portland cement, which really confusingly contains a significant proportion of free lime. The chemistry of what goes on in a cement kiln is not for tonight, but there is free lime. Water getting in at the top of the theoretically waterproof capping is percolating down through the masonry, dissolving that free lime and ejecting it through cracks in the masonry. Is this a failure? Well, no, it's 50 years old. Where were you 50 years ago? Well, not in the same place you're in now, I'm sure. It's a limited success. And it's only a limited success because the Ministry of Works were trying to do the impossible. I don't know how many years, let's say 7,000 years of building history have proved many things, one of which is buildings have to have roofs and ruins don't, at least in my definition at the moment. That lets water into ruins, which destroys the ruin. In particular, it works against the faced and cored wall. It's not much of a friend to earth mortar and lime mortar either. The Ministry of Works tried to get round all these problems by rough racking. Here is a faced and cored wall. What you get out of the quarry, generally speaking, in most parts of Britain, are fairly rounded sort of slabs of stone, which don't have a good side, a flat side. So some poor soul in a quarry has to hit these lumps of stone with an axe, knock off one side to get a roughly flat surface, as you can see in this picture. That produces a lot of lumps, a lot of rubble. You don't want to waste it. If you've spent your time and effort knocking bits of stone about with an axe, you use everything. And so the facing stones were deliberately left with a gap between their inside tails, and the rubble was put into that, along with either lime mortar or earth to bound it all together. It works brilliantly until you let water get in. If water gets in at the top, it washes the earth out more or less straight away, and it dissolves lime mortar pretty quickly too. And if the core isn't mortared, the faces fall off. So it's a good way of constructing, so long as you keep it dry, which gives an immense problem to ruins. Here we've got Nunney Castle up in what is now not Somerset. And here we've got rough racking in action. Why the Ministry of Work called it rough racking, I've no idea, and I've never met anyone who knew. The word came out of nowhere. But its principle is you bed stones in modern ordinary Portland cement, in a very strong ordinary Portland cement mortar, and you angle every stone and position it really cleverly so that it sheds water. You end up with a result that looks like an accidentally ruined wall, but is in fact a conceit, a mirage. It's a sleight of hand. There is nothing accidental about the top of this wall. It's all designed to shed water. And it works. But thermal stress, the change of temperature from day to night, winter to summer, really doesn't do well with ordinary Portland cement. It's brittle. And because it's brittle, and when you stress it, because the stones and itself expand when they get hot, it cracks. Now, these aren't, generally speaking, structurally serious cracks. The thing isn't going to fall down. But one of the unfortunate rules of the universe is that narrow cracks draw water in by capillary attraction, but then don't let it effectively evaporate out again because they're too small. A narrow crack is a one-way system for water, drawing it in and holding it in. And that's what's happening to the Ministry of Works' rough racking. Well, let's have a quick relax from me. Those who know me well, particularly some of my offspring, are devastatingly rude to me and tell me that really all I know about is drains. Well, for you, at no extra cost tonight, I'm lifting my head above my fascination for drains and looking at some whole buildings. Here's one now. This is Cleve Abbey, and in some ways, it is a triumph of minimum intervention conservation. The Ministry of Works took a derelict farm building, in this case, all the buildings were part of a farm, and cleaned it up and waterproofed it and sterilized it. When I first went here in 1960 something, you could barely avoid being sick when you went in because of the smell of timber treatment. Well, that's faded now. But the Ministry of Works' austere academic view of buildings like Cleve Abbey is very much lingering on. Would you want to have a picnic in here? Would you want to sleep the night in here, even in a comfortable bed? Here, this building is so far removed from the idea of having fun that it's just ludicrous. It's sterile. And it gets even worse down in the Undercroft. The Ministry of Works tended to work to a policy of maintain the thing as we found it. But here, they closed their eyes, imagined the future, and did something different. This is a concrete vault put in to simulate what the Undercroft would have looked like. And again, the austerity of it. Bear in mind, of course, that I tell a good story and I don't spoil it in the telling. So I've chosen the photograph to be cold and hard and blue. It's not attractive. Again, you might have an illicit urination in one corner of this, and people do, but you wouldn't have a picnic. It's too cold and hard and austere, and the floor is gravel. It makes railway station platforms in the winter look attractive. And this is the problem of the Ministry of Works' approach. It's not fun. It's not romantic. They've taken this idea of the 18th century gentleman about romance in your back garden and turned it into a desert. And some of their work is downright bizarre. What this broken spiral staircase illustrates is that some brokenness is attractive. People like the SPAB use a magic word, patina. Patina is the golden stain of time. But this ruined staircase isn't a golden stain of time. It's broken and ugly and useless. I'm raising the issue here as how you present buildings needs to be fun, needs to be attractive, it needs to draw you in, not repel you with gravel and academia, but it also needs to be ruined in a gentle way, not this ragged, horrible way. Now, the Ministry of Works was around for a very long time, all of the 20th century, up until really quite recently. And they didn't do the same thing everywhere all the time. It was run by individuals who had individual ideas. The person who did this, I'll talk about what this is just a second, was much obsessed with the idea of minimum repair. You leave things as you found them, you do the absolute minimum of work to them. Now, what's in this picture? It's a blue lyre stone column, which is delaminating. It's splitting up along its natural weakness. And it's been bound together with bronze bands. Well, yeah, well, it's not particularly ugly, it's not offensive, it's pretty good conservation. But look at the other side, and the bronze bands were deemed not to be sufficient to hold the column in place. So there's this bronze leg attached to it, a tail. Once you see it, minimum repair often becomes absurd repair. The borderline between minimum and stupid is a very narrow one. Now, I'm not taking positions on this. I like it. I think that it's only obsessives like me who look around the back of this and say, "Ooh, that's a funny bit of bronze." Most people don't. So it's not as unsuccessful as all that, but it is odd. And this is even odder. This is Kilve Priory, and it's permanent first aid. First aid is a very interesting conservation dimension. It makes sense to do first aid to stop things falling down completely, but it doesn't make so much sense if that first aid becomes permanent, as it has here. I don't know what this metal shore cost, but it won't have been cheap. I quite like it. A lot of people that I've spoken to don't like it at all. And it's quite an odd thing to do. Bear in mind what I said right at the beginning of this, that all of this conservation is experimental. No one had ever done this before. I don't think anyone's done it since. It's an interesting experiment. As is this. Cleve Abbey, again, is rightly famous for having a really superb collection of medieval encaustic floor tiles. And they're a particular problem because once they've been buried and got the dirt of ruin ingrained into them, soluble mineral salts, etc., they don't survive very well when you expose them. So this is a really interesting example of a cover building designed to make them viewable without having them disintegrate. This is brave stuff. If I sound critical of the Ministry of Works, now English Heritage, well, I am, but I'm not totally critical of them. There's an awful lot of people in there who do an awful lot of clever stuff for relatively little money. But what they don't do, he said, getting excited, is maintenance. This is back to Muchelney. The Portland cement glue that was supposed to hold the whole thing together is breaking up. Thermal stress, and I suspect in this case, badly driven lawnmowers, are smashing it to pieces. It's all very well putting in very expensive metal shoring and pretty expensive tile cover buildings when what you've actually got is ruined walls like this, which are falling to pieces. Well, I've mentioned several times that the Ministry of Works, now English Heritage, is desperately short of money. And that raises the issue of beneficial use. Sterilization Castle here had a squatting, a private house built into the ruin a long time ago. It's been modified and gentrified and made civilized by the Landmark Trust. Well, that's given the whole ruin beneficial use. It generates money, income that can be used to mend the whole building. Great stuff. Is this possibly the answer for most of our ruins? Should we be encouraging some sort of internal squatting development for them, holiday homes, for example, some sort of business premise, perhaps? But anyway, a economically viable modern use. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do know that in times of austerity and the removal of government grants and more stuff that I'm going to talk about, we need to look at this quite seriously. Now, the Ministry of Works never had the budget nor the interest to conserve and rebuild and wall cap everything. Lots of things escaped their notice. My favourite is Burgundy Chapel along the north coast of Somerset, which is quite a substantial ruin, which is not being cared for at all. It still has traces of medieval plaster in it. No one's taking any notice. And here in Taunton, nobody took much notice of Taunton Castle for a very long time. There was a huge amount of archaeological work. This doorway used to exit onto ground level. So all of this is removed fallen masonry, a big archaeological effort. But that archaeological effort made almost no attempt to consolidate the masonry that had been exposed. A huge amount of brilliant work has been done by SANHS in managing vegetation on the site, cutting trees down and planting grass and uninvasive plants. 3 cheers for SANHS on this. Another thing that the ministry didn't get to, Borough Mump. And Borough Mump's a strange thing. Get over visions of Alfred burning the cakes. That's total historical nonsense. But then this is historical nonsense. It's a folly. It was built as a ruin. Because it was built as a ruin, water getting into the wall core has never been that much of a problem. So it's surviving quite well, thank you. But then we have a sort of ruin that never attracted the Ministry of Works' attention because it was industrial. Although what they created at Kilve, for example, isn't in the slightest romantic, 18th century gentlemen would not be entranced by it. Well, this certainly wouldn't entrance 18th century gentlemen. It's part of an industrial complex designed to get oil out of the shale rocks at Kilve, and nobody's looking after it. Or you've got the lead smelting flues at Charterhouse on the Mendips. These are tunnels. They're effectively a horizontal chimney where lead ore was resmelted. Roman and medieval slag was resmelted, and in a blast furnace, which sent the fumes up this horizontal zigzag chimney where they condensed out, and young parish apprentices were sent in to sweep it up. We've got this. The First World War was a very long time ago, and the Second World War was even longer ago than I have existed, just. And it's produced a lot of interesting ruins. This is a gunnery observation post at the end of Breen Down. Well, at some stage, someone, presumably in the National Trust, noticed that the roof was collapsing because the steel that held it up was corroding, and rushed in and put up these acro props. Well, the acro props themselves now are corroding so badly that they're not really serviceable anymore. Collapse is not far away. At what point does history come to a full stop? How old do ruins have to be worthy of conservation? I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect World War II monuments are really quite deserving of conservation. Where have we got to? We've got to crisis, ladies and gentlemen. You don't often hear crisis talked about in SANHS lectures, but here goes. The ordinary Portland cement rough racking is cracking, it's failing, it's letting water in. It's almost impossible to do anything economical about it because you've got to dismantle it completely in order to re-cement it. And that would be extremely expensive. And in any case, it wouldn't last all that long because the thermal stress that cracked it in the first place hasn't gone away. So what has the English Heritage ex-Ministry of Works come up with? It's come up with soft wall capping. History, no good. Skara Brae, very good. It's surviving quite nicely. And there's no cement in the wall capping. It's got grass. QED, the answer to modern conservation of ruined walls is to use turf to put the tops on. It works. It's surprisingly good at keeping water out. It even generates a very small amount of warmth, which tends to keep the masonry more frost-free. But Skara Brae is not Somerset. In Somerset, the weather's different. And the grass that's been applied to part of Taunton Castle for soft capping at the end of the last summer was not doing very well. It gets too dry. Well, if you know the weather in the Orkneys, Skara Brae rarely gets too dry. Because of the weather difference, you can't generalize from one place to another when it comes to growing plants. Every gardener knows this. And soft wall capping comes with a maintenance demand. The Ministry of Works and English Heritage at Muchelney, for example, hasn't succeeded in stopping the weeds growing on ordinary Portland cement mortared stonework, which is pretty sterile. Here at Clicket, which is a fascinating set of ruins, but take wellies if you're going to go there, has a problem that illustrates the problem of all soft wall capping. If you don't maintain the soft wall capping, other things start to grow. There is a chain of plant growth which ends up in large trees. And the tree roots here at Clicket are demolishing the walls. English Heritage, the Ministry of Works, has what I can only call a lamentable record for maintenance in time, or timely maintenance. It is a real risk that soft wall capping, although it works, will lead to a forest. Well, another aspect of crisis at the moment, austerity. The plug has been pulled in local authority spending and on conservation spending. Money is in absurdly short supply. This has been made much worse by the privatisation of the Ministry of Works' direct labour force. That's a lecture in its own right, but bear in mind that when the Ministry of Works had its own workers, they had a vested interest in maintaining the ruins they worked on. Modern contractors, that vested interest is much less. Then there is a big problem of staff turnover and corporate memory. It's pretty true that English Heritage, Historic England, can't remember what they did 30 years ago. The people have changed, and I hear you say, well, they have a library, and they do have a library, but libraries are no use unless you know what you want to look for. And the English Heritage Library is not well catalogued when it comes to conservation on a technical level. And then the splitting of English Heritage and Historic England, words fail me. One of the interesting things that ought to be on conservation's agenda is what's happened at Hurst Castle. There are no villains here. Lack of money has meant that essential maintenance has not got done, and a large chunk of the castle has collapsed into the sea. Apologies for the state of the picture, but it was taken by a friend of mine from a boat which was in fairly rough water. It's an absolutely brilliant picture, all things considered. Well, in Hurst Castle, over the collapse of Hurst Castle, in theory, Historic England should be prosecuting English Heritage for not looking after the monuments in their care. But I think it's about as likely as a voluntary resignation note from Boris Johnson. The future, ladies and gentlemen, the future is very unclear. The world created by Frank Baines is no longer the current world, and the dangers faced by monuments and ruins is a new set of dangers. I suspect that we've really got to seriously look at beneficial use if we're going to keep our ruins. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I've got to say. And I will let my managers invite questions.
Thank you very much, Bruce. That was really quite interesting.
This is praise from a wife.
Indeed, praise from a wife. It is a real problem what to do with ruins in the future. We don't use ruins in the same way that was done prior to the 17th century, when people just used the old structures as a useful wall that you could actually add another building onto. So a lot of ruined buildings were just built into, really. The way we have the exposure of ruins and the sort of the way we look at them and use them as part of a way of interpreting history is going to cause, as you say, tremendous difficulties in the future on what to do with them, because we're trying to preserve them rather than actually use them. it would be interesting to try and think of what one could do in the future to try to keep them going if you had to. I mean, should we all be living in the ruins again, using them, facilitating them to...
I think there's an easy answer for Hurst Castle. We should reinstall the gunnery and fire on ships invading from France.
Well, it may happen, you never know, yes. Does anybody have any questions? If you have any questions for Bruce, please type them into the chat button and I will interpret them for you. That'd be very helpful. I've got one here. It says, does any other countries have better ways to manage ruins?
There are many different ways. As you go around the globe, there are hugely varied approaches to history, let alone the history of ruins and the conservation of ruins. For example, if you're in India and you're Hindu, you believe in reincarnation. And if the world works on reincarnation, well, it's all going to come round again anyway. Why do you need to conserve things now? That's one aspect to it. In the Far East, because of the use of more timber than in most of the world, and partitions in different structures altogether, different ways of jointing wood, complete rebuilding is conservation. Partial rebuilding and repair is not generally on the Japanese agenda. That produces different levels of interest in historic buildings. If you go to America, they apply modern materials to colonial Williamsburg, for example. It's all gloss painted in plastic paint. They have utterly different ideas about mortars and materials. Us and northern France have a broadly similar approach. The SPAB was quite influential in France. Germany is completely different. It restores everything completely. Italy is casual. I mean, you appreciate these are international stereotypes of the worst sort, but the Italians have got so much historic stuff, they tend not to be too bothered about any particular bit of it. You want a Roman palace? Well, we have hundreds. Yeah. So there is commonality, but it's not universal. For example, the use of lime in historic buildings is an obsession in Britain these days, but that's not so in France and Germany and Italy. And beyond that, well, lime, forget it.
Yeah, it is interesting how different cultures interpret their ruins, isn't it?
Yeah.
A question here. Have you ever been to Astley Castle? And if you have, what did you think of the work done there?
I never have. I've seen lots of pictures of it, and I am perplexed by it to the point where, because I haven't been there, I don't think I can say anything.
Okay, that's a fair comment. Well done. Question here. You comment on the... Oh, there's a tendency to disappear. So many questions coming in, they're all disappearing up the screen. Can you comment on the dichotomy of beneficial use as living accommodation, etc., versus public access? I'm thinking here of places like Burrowmump, which is a popular site for visitors. That's a good question.
It is a very good question. And I can certainly comment on this dichotomy, but I can't give you any complete and realistic answers. Any beneficial use comes at a cost. It comes at a cost in the modification of historic fabric, the putting of heat into places that haven't been heated, which disrupts the behavior of historic fabric. And the public access issue is a real issue. You can't go into Sterilization Castle in the way that you could if it was an unoccupied Ministry of Works monument. It's a huge loss. And I suppose the answer is that beneficial use ought to include beneficial use as an unrestricted access monument paid for by the state. But we aren't going to get that.
No.
So the realistic beneficial use is part privatization.
It's almost inevitable, I suppose, really, isn't it? Another question here. I wonder how far the Heritage Lottery Fund would seriously encourage the financing of ruins to be incorporated into new developments to showcase our cultural heritage. Just a thought.
Well, I've been warned not to be rude about anybody, and I've really done my best. And for example, English heritage are not figures of lament and horror to me. They're doing their best. They just haven't got enough money. On the other hand, the lottery is a regressive tax on the ignorant poor and should be abolished.
It is very difficult, though. It's difficult. You know, you have to raise your money from somewhere, otherwise.
It's immoral. You shouldn't take money from the devil.
It's not a good way to finance the repair of our ancient buildings, I agree.
It's also arbitrary that they don't use the same criteria that the Ministry of Works used to. And so the sort of monuments that get conserved and the way in which they're conserved is also different. They put strings on it. It has to have beneficial social effects.
It is a difficulty because they're not just focusing on the structure of the building. There are other aspects to it that, yes. Hey ho, we only wish that we had a rich country. Okay, let's move on. Okay, somebody visited Sterilization but couldn't access anything because the gates were locked. It also looked rather dilapidated. That's a great shame, actually, because that's now run by
Landmark Trust.
Landmark Trust, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some very lovely work was done on it in the past, I remember. Someone in historic IHBC suggested that in rural areas, ruined farmsteads might be treated as brownfield sites in planning terms due to their strategic location. Thus, these new buildings outside development boundaries might ensure beneficial use of ruins. So that's another example, possibly, of starting squatting in ruins of.
Yeah,
interesting idea.
The problem has been raised in the earlier question that if you give beneficial use by private ownership, you restrict access, and that really is a problem. Lizzie and I both stayed in a really fabulous flat in Vicenza, which was part of the Roman amphitheatre and had extensive Roman amphitheatre parts in it. But it was a private flat. It cost a fortune to stay there. Yeah, it's an unresolvable question.
It is unresolvable, really, isn't it? Because, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the problem is that ruins are exposed. It's not like trying to repair buildings that have roofs on. Most ruins do not have a roof, and that makes them so much more vulnerable to the deteriorating circumstances.
That's it, yeah. It's often, in the case of redundant churches, suggested that community use is the answer. But to take Sterilization as an example, it's already got a parish hall, it's already got a church. How much community space is supportable? Particularly community space that would be expensive to create.
Yes. Difficult question. If anybody wants to ask questions, we can't see you if you're raising your hand, but if you type into the chat button, we can see your questions there. Okay, lovely one down here. Should historic buildings, etc., be conserved or preserved as buildings, and life in general are subject to evolutionary processes?
Yeah, I think there's a very good analogy here with what happens in medicine, that doctors make agonizing choices about who should be saved and who should not. And they attach bracelets to the wrists of those who are not to be saved, which say NFU, or not for resuscitation, NFR, sorry. NFU is the Farmers Union, it's a different thing altogether. These are horribly difficult decisions. In the end, it becomes uneconomic and not sensible to maintain decaying masonry. There is a point of let go, but where that point is may be different for different people, and it's never, I was going to say never concrete, but that's not what I meant. I mean, it's never obvious and certain. The SPAB used to define itself as a school of rational builders. And part of being rational about ruins or standing buildings is deciding when you let go.
Yeah, that's very difficult. People have opinions on that, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
If we had unlimited resources, we'd never have to let go, but we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another question here, your proposals presupposes development, but you have not commented on the potential impact of building regulations. Might these not hamstring any effort to combine housing with heritage buildings? He's thinking of thermal efficiency laws.
Yes, another lecture there. Yes, there is a real problem. Part L in particular, that is the conservation, the rules on the conservation of heat and power, do not sit happily with old buildings, let alone ruins. And there's no immediately obvious solution to that. An enormous part of our housing stock doesn't anywhere near meet modern standards for heat and power conservation. And the warming of the world suggests that we need to do something about it. Historic ruins are a bit of a sideshow in all of this because there really aren't that many compared to domestic houses. But yeah, it's a real problem and it really will be an issue. In the past, there have been a lot of let-outs. For example, the captain's house on the Isle of Portland turned into a huge row between conservation officer and the building control officer, which was won out of personalities. Now, that's not a logical way to run any control system, but it is what happens quite a lot. You know, you can, oh, it's distasteful to mention it, but it's relevant. You can scare off the building control officer if you make life too difficult, as proved by Grenfell Tower.
Well done. Okay, more interesting questions coming in. There's been some recent work by volunteers at the Burgundy Chapel, you'll be pleased to know. Although I think COVID has hampered the efforts, we're hoping to do some scheduled monument condition surveys this year and involve volunteers in regular surveys.
That is wonderful news, and
yes, I thought you'd like that.
It highlights a problem with giving a talk like this, which is by examining problems and issues, it all tends to get a bit depressing. But life out there is more resilient than that. Dedicated people do stuff and they do good stuff, and here's to them.
Absolutely. Well done. Well, I think we're actually coming to the end of our time now. Well done. That was actually quite enjoyable. Thank you very much. And I will read some notes and queries now for everybody else. So thank you very much, Bruce. So we have two forthcoming events, SANHS webinars coming up very soon. On the 27th of January, Tony Harding's going to talk about the finer points of timber framing as discovered as part of the early Dunster project. That will be fascinating. On the 16th of February, Tom Maybury from Taunton Museum will give a lecture on the sale of Taunton Castle. And later on the 28th of April, our latest webinar with Julian Orbach, who used to be the president of the Society, is going to give a lecture on the chapels of Somerset. We also have a lot of live events coming up. If you need to know about any live events, do go to our website and they will be listed there. Besides SANHS events, on the 13th of January, the Bath and Counties Archaeological Society are going to give a live lecture on the Iron Age and Roman Silchester, which sounds fascinating. Further details of that is on the SANHS website. So don't forget, if you want to get a copy of Bruce's book, it's an ebook, the link will be in the chat button and I can see it right there. And there will also be the link for the donations button. To find that, of course, you just go to the SANHS website and it's under donations. And of course, if you want to join SANHS, just go to the website. There'll be something there for you to join as well. That only leaves me to thank Bruce for his excellent talk. And of course, the webinar team, Nathanael, Tony and Harriet, and of course, to thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and we will hopefully see you again at our next SANHS lecture. Thank you and goodbye.